me begin with a question, not a rhetorical question, a real one. What would you do if you watched a video of a world leader declaring war, calling for surrender, confessing to a crime, and every single thing about that video looked completely undeniably real? The voice, the face, the mannerisms, the setting, and then discovered hours later that none of it ever happened, that the person never said any of it, that it was fabricated entirely by a machine. That is not a hypothetical anymore. That is the world we are already living in. I want to talk to you today about something that I believe is one of the most urgent moral and civilizational challenges of our time. Not because it is new. I have been raising these concerns for many years now, but because it has now moved from the realm of theoretical warning to documented, verified, real-world electoral interference. And I want to suggest to you that the intellectual and philosophical frameworks we need to navigate this crisis were not invented yesterday. They have been available to us all along. We simply have not been paying attention. But before I tell you what those frameworks are, and I will, I want to make sure you understand exactly what is happening on the ground, because unless you feel the weight of the specific, the concrete, the documented, abstract philosophical principles will feel like a luxury we cannot afford. So stay with me, because what I am about to describe will, I think, genuinely disturb you, and it should. In the 2024 Slovak parliamentary elections, voters received automated telephone calls in which a voice sounding exactly like Michal Semeka, the leader of the Liberal Progressive Slovakia Party, appeared to be discussing how to rig the election and raise the price of beer. The audio was fabricated. It was a deep fake released just 48 hours before polling day, deliberately timed to fall within the mandatory media silence period when candidates have no legal mechanism to respond. Semeka's party lost. We cannot prove causation, but we can observe correlation. And we can ask ourselves, did those calls change votes? Of course they did, because misinformation does not need to be believed by everyone. It only needs to create enough doubt, enough confusion, enough hesitation to shift a margin, and Slovakia was not alone. In the United States, during the January 2024 New Hampshire Democratic primary, thousands of voters received robocalls featuring a voice indistinguishable from President Joe Biden's, telling them not to vote to save their vote for November. A fabricated voice, a real suppression attempt. The culprit, a political consultant named Steve Kramer, later admitted to commissioning the calls. He was fined a mere $6 million by the Federal Communications Commission, a financial penalty that, in the broader scheme of electoral influence, amounts to little more than a cost of doing business in Bangladesh. In the lead-up to the January 2024 general election, deepfake videos circulated of opposition politicians making inflammatory statements. In Pakistan, Imran Khan, imprisoned and unable to campaign, delivered speeches to his supporters via an AI-generated voice cloned from previous recordings, raising entirely new questions about the line between political adaptation and technological deception. In India, during the world's largest democratic exercise in 2024, AI-generated content spread at a scale that fact-checkers simply could not keep pace with. Now I want you to hold all of that in your mind, because here is the question that should be keeping you awake at night. 2024 was, by some counts, the largest election year in human history. Over 60 countries held national elections. More than 4 billion people were eligible to vote. More than half the population of the entire planet. And AI-generated disinformation was present in virtually every major contest. We are not at the beginning of this problem. We are already deep inside it, and I am afraid that most of our institutions, our regulatory bodies, our legal frameworks, our media organizations, even our educational systems, are responding with the speed and agility of a horse and cart trying to catch a supersonic aircraft. Now, I promised you something. I told you there were frameworks available to us. Frameworks that, had we been paying attention, might have prepared us better for this moment. Let me tell you what I mean. I have spent many years now thinking and writing about the intersection of artificial intelligence and what I would call the deep questions of human existence. Questions of meaning, of identity, of truth, of moral responsibility. My book, 2084, Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Humanity, published in 2020, was an attempt to take seriously the trajectory of these technologies and ask what they mean for human beings, not merely as economic actors or political citizens, but as persons made in the image of a rational, communicating, truth-telling God. One of the central arguments I made in that book, and which I have continued to develop in subsequent lectures and writings, is that the most dangerous dimension of artificial intelligence is not physical. It is not the robot with the metal arm. It is not even the autonomous weapons system, terrifying as those are. The most dangerous dimension is epistemic. It is the capacity of these technologies to undermine our ability to know what is true. The philosopher Aristotle defined truth with disarming simplicity. To say of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not is true. To say of what is that it is not, or of what is not that it is false. That is the foundation of rational discourse. It is the foundation of science. It is the foundation of law. It is the foundation of democracy itself. And artificial intelligence, when weaponized by those with the will to deceive, strikes directly at that foundation. When a voter cannot trust whether the video they are watching of a political candidate is real, they face a crisis that is not merely technological, it is ontological. It is a crisis of reality itself. And I want to suggest to you that a society which loses its grip on the distinction between truth and falsehood does not merely suffer politically. It suffers spiritually. It suffers morally. It loses the very capacity for the kind of public reasoning on which self-governance depends. The political theorist Hannah Arendt, writing about totalitarianism long before anyone had dreamed of generative AI, observed that the ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi or the convinced communist, but the person for whom the distinction between fact and fiction no longer exists. Let that sentence land, because that is precisely the psychological state that a sustained campaign of deepfake disinformation is designed to produce. Not necessarily to convince people of any particular lie, but to produce in them a generalized epistemological despair, a throwing up of the hands, a who can know anything anymore, which is, of course, the most politically useful mental state you can produce in a population you wish to manipulate. Now, some of you may be thinking, Professor Lennox, this is very alarming, but surely the technology also has defenses. Surely there are detection tools, watermarking systems, authentication mechanisms. And you are right, there are. But here is what the research consistently shows. The development of detection tools lags behind the development of generation tools. The defenders are always catching up to the attackers. The Center for Countering Digital Hate published findings in 2023 showing that the major AI image generators failed to block election misinformation prompts roughly 41% of the time. A 2024 study by the Alan Turing Institute found that deepfake detection models trained on one dataset performed significantly worse when tested against deepfakes produced by newer generation methods. We are, in other words, in an arms race, and historically arms races favor those who are willing to use weapons without scruple. This is why I insist that the response to this crisis cannot be merely technological. I said this in 2020, I said it again in 2023, and I say it now with even greater urgency. A purely technological response to a moral problem is like treating the symptoms of a disease while leaving the underlying pathology untouched. Let me put it to you directly. The creation and deployment of deepfakes in electoral contexts is not merely a violation of platform terms of service. It is not merely a breach of campaign finance law. It is an assault on the rational agency of every citizen who encounters that content. It treats human beings, real, dignified, rational persons, as objects to be manipulated rather than subjects to be persuaded. And in doing so, it violates something that I believe is not merely a political value, but a moral and indeed a theological one, the dignity of the human person as a truth-seeking, truth-deserving being. I want to spend some time on something that I think is not discussed nearly enough in these conversations, which is the question of who bears responsibility, because one of the most insidious features of this technology is what I would call its diffusion of moral agency. When a deepfake is produced, who is responsible? The programmer who wrote the underlying model, the company that deployed the platform, the user who uploaded the fabricated content, the social media algorithm that amplified it, the political operative who commissioned it. In most current legal and regulatory frameworks, the answer is genuinely unclear, and that unclarity is not accidental. It is, in many cases, carefully engineered. The moral philosopher Peter French wrote extensively about corporate moral agency. The question of whether organizations, as distinct from the individuals within them, can be meaningfully held responsible for moral wrongs. This is now one of the most pressing questions in AI ethics. When an AI company builds a tool that is subsequently used to produce election-influencing deepfakes, what is their responsibility? The answer, I would argue, cannot be none, simply because the misuse was carried out by a third party. The concept of foreseeability matters enormously in moral reasoning, and it is simply not credible for a technology company in 2024 to claim that they could not have foreseen the electoral misuse of a hyper-realistic voice or video synthesis tool. The European Union's AI Act, which entered into force in August 2024, attempts to address some of this through its tiered risk classification system. AI systems used to influence elections are categorized as high risk, triggering transparency requirements and conformity assessments. Deepfakes, synthetic media that depicts real people, are required under Article 50 to be labeled as such. These are steps in the right direction. They are also, I must say, somewhat like installing a smoke detector after the house is already burned down. The legislation is welcome, but the pace of its development tells us something important. Democratic institutions move at the speed of deliberation, while technology moves at the speed of computation. I want to pause here and say something about the Christian intellectual tradition, because I think it has something genuinely important to contribute to this conversation that is almost entirely absent from secular policy discourse. The Christian understanding of the human person begins with a claim that is philosophically extraordinary, that human beings are made in the image of God, the imago Dei. And one of the central implications of that doctrine, as developed throughout the theological tradition from Augustine through Aquinas to contemporary thinkers, is that the human capacity for reason and for truth-seeking is not merely a product of evolutionary pressure. It is a reflection of the rationality of the Creator himself. This means that when we deceive, and particularly when we deceive at scale, systematically using technological power to override the rational agency of millions of people, we are not merely committing a political crime. We are committing something that the tradition would recognize as a profound moral violation. We are treating the image of God in our neighbor as an obstacle to be bypassed, rather than a dignity to be respected. And this also means that the response to AI-driven epistemic crisis is not merely institutional or regulatory, though it must be those things too. It is also profoundly personal and moral. It requires the cultivation of what classical philosophy called practical wisdom, phronesis, the capacity to perceive and respond appropriately to the moral dimensions of particular situations. In a world of deepfakes, this means cultivating the habits of epistemic humility, asking where information comes from, who benefits from its circulation, what the incentives of the producers are. It means recovering the lost art of slow reading, careful verification, and the willingness to say, I do not know, rather than simply sharing content that confirms our prior beliefs. I am aware that this sounds demanding. It is demanding. But democracy has always been demanding. The Athenians knew it, the American founders knew it. Thomas Jefferson wrote, and I think this bears repetition, that an educated citizenry is a vital requisite for our survival as a free people. Jefferson was talking about newspaper literacy in the 18th century. We are talking about AI literacy in the 21st. The principle is identical. The stakes are, if anything, higher. There is one more dimension of this I want to address before I close, and it is perhaps the most philosophically interesting. It concerns what I would call the personhood paradox of AI-generated content. When you watch a deepfake video of a real politician saying something they never said, you are not merely encountering a false statement, you are encountering a simulacrum, a representation that has the form of personhood without the substance. The face is there, the voice is there, the apparent intentionality is there, but the person is not. And yet it acts in the world of social media, in the minds of viewers, as if it were a person. This raises a question that I find genuinely fascinating and genuinely disturbing. What is the relationship between the digital representation of a person and the person themselves? We have always had misrepresentation, caricature, parody, slander, but we have never before had misrepresentation so perfect that it is indistinguishable by the unaided human eye and ear from the original. This is qualitatively new, and it demands that we think very carefully about the nature of identity, authenticity, and what it means to have a public voice in democratic discourse. The philosopher Charles Taylor wrote about what he called the authenticity ideal, the notion deeply embedded in modern Western culture that each person has an original way of being human, which it is their moral task to discover and articulate. Deepfakes represent, in a very real sense, the technological violation of authenticity. They take someone's original way of being, their voice, their face, their manner, and use it to say things they would never say, to commit in the digital realm a kind of identity theft more profound than the theft of credit card details. They steal not your financial identity, but your epistemic identity, your standing as a truth teller in the public square. And this is why I believe the fight against electoral deepfakes is not, at its deepest level, a fight about technology policy. It is a fight about what kind of society we want to be. Do we want to be a society in which the powerful can manufacture consent through the simulation of authentic voices? Or do we want to be a society committed to the idea that democratic legitimacy must be built on a foundation of honest persuasion of real people making real arguments to real fellow citizens who are free to accept or reject them? These are not questions with easy answers, but they are the right questions. And the fact that we are being forced to ask them by the emergence of artificial intelligence is not, I think, a reason for despair. I have never been a pessimist about these technologies, despite what some of my critics occasionally suggest. I believe that human beings, precisely because they are rational and moral creatures, have within them the capacity to confront and navigate even the most formidable technological challenges. What they require in order to do so is not merely better algorithms or tighter regulations, though we need those too. What they require is wisdom. And wisdom, as the oldest traditions of human reflection have always insisted, begins with the recognition that we are not the measure of all things. In 2020, writing about AI in a broader context, I noted that the question which would define our technological future was not what can machines do, but what should human beings do and be in a world of increasingly capable machines. That question has not changed. What has changed is the urgency with which it demands an answer. The elections have been run. The deepfakes have been deployed. The votes have been cast. And somewhere in the gap between what those voters believed they saw and heard and what was actually real, a democratic choice was made or unmade by a machine on behalf of people who never disclosed their identities and never submitted themselves to the judgment of any electorate. That should trouble all of us deeply. And it should impel us as citizens, as educators, as policymakers, as moral agents, to take seriously the work of building the institutional, technological, educational, and above all, the moral and philosophical defenses that this moment demands. The warning was there. The analysis was available. The ethical frameworks existed. The question was always whether we had the wisdom, the will, and the courage to act on them before the crisis arrived. The crisis has arrived. The question now is what we do next. Thank you.